We've arrived at chapter 8 in our study of Lord of the Flies, a chapter in the narrative where some of the issues that have been bubbling under the surface are really coming through. We see the killing of the sow, the dispute between Jack and Ralph intensifying, as well as the establishment of the symbolic Lord of the Flies. And in this chapter in particular, we see that savagery that has been there in the background throughout this novel and our study of the novel really come through and break through, and it's now unleashed completely in the world of this novel. So with that in mind, we were going to look at 3 questions to really focus our study with chapter 8 of Lord of the Flies. And the first one of those is, what does the increasing dispute between Ralph and Jack signal? And that will allow us to pick up on the questions of civility versus savagery, order versus disorder, democracies versus authoritarian rule, and to continue our investigation of some of those concepts, which are also significant issues under debate and discussion in this part of the 20th century. Given that the sow is killed in this chapter, we'll consider why that killing is significant, what's being signified and represented to us. And finally, because Simon engages with the sow's head, the Lord of the Flies, we will then go on and ask, what does this signal, and why does Golding signal it at this stage of the novel? We'll then look to track and trace those ideas across the novel, setting you up to do that more independently for yourself, before we go into our final videos examining the closing chapters of William Golding's The Lord of the Flies. Okay, so we have this passage from chapter 8 where the boys are killing the sow, and this really extended passage where we see the brutality of the boys and the sadistic quality of the boys and the total movement from order towards disorder and savagery. And we have this initial focus just shortly and briefly on Jack. We've had the fallout between Ralph and Jack, and we have that separation of the two of them, and the boys going in 2 very different directions with 2 very different sets of focuses as well. And we have there this position of Jack being in charge of the hunters. It's Jack in control, Jack who is leading them. We have his arms straightening and pointing. He's dominating the boys, and he's in total control at this moment of this group of boys. He is really assuming the position of an authoritarian figure. Okay, no more democracy here with Jack. He is an authoritarian figure in total control of the boys. We've also seen earlier in the novel that boys throwing the spears into the pig, they're not sticking. So the boys are beginning to develop their own equipment and technology. The spears now have fire-hardened points. So the boys are actively improving their methods and their means of killing. They're becoming more efficient killers in much the same way as we see warfare and the technology associated with warfare develop rapidly. We see here the boys adapting and responding to the ways that they have to hunt in this setting and environment. So we have that set up, this authoritarian figure and the rapid development of the boys' equipment so that they become more efficient killers. But Golding then gives us this focus on the impact of these weapons. We have a lexical field of struggle and distress being very strongly articulated at this point. That verb staggered and the gasping squeal. So the boys are imposing harm on the sow. We have got the impact of cruelty being portrayed in these sadistic and excessively violent terms, and there is an excess of pain and suffering here being illustrated to us. So the boys, these British boys who should be demonstrating the best of Britain, are quite willing and quite prepared to inflict pain and suffering on this sow. Perhaps this is a symbolic or an allegorical reference to the way in which the British Empire imposed pain and suffering on native populations as well. So we have that fire-hardened stick, that development of technology, but we are also seeing the consequence of that. All of a sudden the sow is now gasping and squealing. And we have this continued movement despite the improvement of their equipment, but the boys are shouting and rushing. They're not ordered, they're fully chaotic at this point. We have disorder starting to dominate and completely take over, and it simply leaves to the pigs scattering. So despite this slight development in their technology actually it's just leading to further chaos, further disorder, a further impact on the natural world and the natural environment. So, as we continue to move through this passage, Golding introduces and reinforces symbolism around the natural world and the natural environment. And he does paint this picture of the boys' damage of the natural world and the natural environment, of perhaps Western cultures and English cultures' impact and destruction of native environments. And we refer to those sorts of readings as a post-colonial reading. But nature here, being too dark and tangled, is trying to form a protective barrier to protect the pig, but it's unable to disguise the sow. And here we have humanity's destructive presence, and humanity's destructive presence being too strong to resist the boys, to resist humanity. And it has no barrier, has no way of preventing the damage that humanity does. As the passage moves on, we have this pathetic fallacy here of the afternoon being hazy and dreadful with damp heat. So the atmosphere has become oppressive. The atmosphere has become overwhelming, and certainly it's changing. Remember, at the start of the novel we had this Edenic beauty, but now we have this dreadful with damp heat. Those harsh dental sounds are warning us of the potential disaster that we're going to see in the island, and particularly as the novel continues to progress and move forward. Now, in opposition to that, we are given this image of the bright flowers grew and the butterflies dance around. But in binary opposition to that, immediately the air was hot and still. Golding reminds us of the beauty of the natural world and the natural environment, but he places that in immediate opposition to this oppressive quality that is taking over the island. And it's interesting that the longer the island is inhabited by the boys, the more oppressive, the more restrictive the weather and the descriptions of the weather become. So we have this last fleeting moment of beauty that is about to be utterly disrupted and destroyed by the presence of the boys as they kill the sow in this setting. And certainly, as we've said, when we consider the way in which the boys and the island are perhaps represented as a mirror image to one another, the longer the boys on the island, the more dark and ominous this setting becomes, the faster the natural world appears to be symbolically corrupted by the presence of the boys as a whole. And as such, within this allegory, Golding is portraying the way in which humanity's presence is always destructive. It always tears down and destroys environments. So the next aspect, now we've traced and tracked the representation of nature, is to look at the way in which blood is being symbolically used through this passage. And we have this first intensification as we move from just the single noun on its own to the noun phrase, vivid blood. So as the sow is fleeing, the blood is intensifying. It's getting brighter and more colourful. It's becoming a even stronger beacon that are allowing the boys to hunt down the sow so that they can kill it. And with that, these bright marks of blood are almost staining and a reminder of the damage that the boys are doing on the island whilst they're there. Furthermore, because they're now vivid, those stains can't be ignored, that harm can't be ignored, can't be cast to one side, so we have that as well. Golding is not allowing us to ignore the brilliance of the blood and therefore the consequences of the violence. And here we have now that developing again, excited by the long chase and the dropped blood. There is, particularly with that word excited, that lexical choice excited, there is an enjoyment there. There is a sadistic attitude where they're enjoying the violence. There is a pleasure being taken in the violence. And violence and pleasure being equated together as more blood is dropping out and draining out of the sow. In that sense then, Golding is showing us the way in which if violence is satisfying, then he's warning us of the brutality of the human condition and the way in which we inevitably revert to that brutality the longer that we have to live without the orders and restraints and the civility of the more ordered parts of Western society. And finally, the boys here being referred to as hunters, they're no longer being referred to as boys. So the innocent versions of the boys, the innocent imagery of the boys is being cast aside now. And they are being referred to as hunters. And later we see that develop again as they're referred only to as savages. And with that in mind, that single-minded focus is on violence now, when they're wedded to her in lust. They're lusting after the violence, the desire to kill, and the determination to kill. So, with our penultimate reference to blood in this passage, and the air was full of sweat and noise and blood and terror. So we have a movement here from concrete nouns and sweat and blood towards terror, which is an abstract noun. And as we do this, we see the way in which the sow is defined in concrete terms. But as the boys overwhelm the sow, clamber over her, harm it, injure it, wound it, they're being blended and mixed together. So we move from these concrete representations to them being almost indistinguishable from one another. So we're moving from concrete to abstract nouns, from sweat to terror. We're no longer able to see the difference between the sow and the boys. And we're starting to see, therefore, that the boys and the sow are not that dissimilar from each other, equally vulnerable, equally easy to harm. So we have here a representation and a warning from Golding. And it's the way in which the boys are just as vulnerable and just as likely to be harmed and just as likely to be slaughtered as the pig, as the sow. The boys are prey in the same way as the sow on the island. And certainly this preempts the death of Piggy and Simon. It predicts the death of Piggy and Simon because of the way Golding is bringing these two aspects into alignment with one another. We have here this final reference to blood, and the hot blood is now spouting over Jack's hands. So it's this final stage where we just get the word, the noun blood, and it slowly becomes more grotesque and more intense as we move through this section. And it's the outcome of the boys' savagery. The outcome of the boys' savagery has become utterly uncontrolled, and it's become completely destructive. And in that sense, it's like the way in which the wider world savagery has been exposed through war and conflict. So we have this final section, this final short section I wanted just to jump to quickly, because this is the moment when the Lord of the Flies is created, and it's almost presented in a ritualistic manner, like a ritual, like a process. Because Jack, first of all, holds up the head before jamming the soft throat down. It's as though he's revelling in and celebrating the outcome of this violence. And these rituals have changed. Remember the rituals in the opening of the novel, and it feels like a long time ago at this point in the narrative. The rituals were about democracy, they were about order, they were about control. And now, instead, the boys are celebrating the damage that they've done, and they're marking their success. They're marking that brutality, they're marking that violence. And we therefore have this representation of humanity's violence intensifying. And Golding here is revealing the way in which humanity has had its brutality, its savagery revealed, as well as representing the way that humanity revels in and celebrates the outcome of savagery. Ultimately, we celebrate a victory in battle, but let's not forget that those battles themselves are savage and violent things. Again, we have that moment continue to develop as the stick pokes through the mouth. And there is this dismemberment. You know, the sow's head has been cut off here. The sow's body, the sow as a figure, has been totally destroyed. It's no longer definable as a sow. It's just referred to here as a head. The sow is being referred to its different body parts, no longer as one entity and as one being. The sow has been reduced, destroyed, and is no longer recognisable as a sow. Having said all of the having said all of that about the brutality and the celebration of that, the boys have a momentary recognition of the horror of their own savagery. They step back because they identify the horror of their act. They can see that, and they see that for the first time. And nature and the natural world, Golding has that reflect that pause in that moment, because the forest is then very still. Having had this chaotic moment as the boys killed the sow, actually the natural world pauses as well, and we are being almost demanded and forced to look at the outcome of this violence, and we are being forced to contemplate this butchery. We're being forced to consider the outcome of the savagery of humanity and what happens when order gives way to disorder and civility moves to savagery. And finally, we have the buzzing of flies over the spilled guts. And that is a symbol, an image, that is an image of decay that symbolises perhaps the moral, the ethical decay of humanity itself. Humanity losing its sense of what it means to be truly human. And this brings us into our next and final passage as we look at Simon's confrontation with the Lord of the Flies. So first of all, let's look at this symbol of the Lord of the Flies itself, because it does sit at the centre of the novel. It is the heart of the novel. It's the title of the novel, after all, as well. But we need to always treat this as a symbol, because we're dealing with an allegory, as we've said a number of times through this video series. And this is perhaps at the heart and at the centre of the allegory, is we have the true brutality, the horror and the darkness of mankind confirmed and stressed at this point. We have flies swarming around the pig's head, as though the pig's head is in control of those flies. But equally, we have these flies swarming because the head itself is rotting and decomposing. And we could read that as a reflection of the way that humanity itself, as it moved towards savagery through World War II, itself was rotting morally and ethically. And certainly also this works in conjunction with the symbolic darkness and blackness that we are shown throughout the course of the novel as well. There is an evil at the heart of mankind, a rotten, decaying moral and spiritual core of humanity, and the Lord of the Flies, as part of this allegory, absolutely symbolises that. In that sense then, humanity is being reduced to this rotting flesh. And we see the absolute and total decay of flesh symbolising and reminding us of the way in which humanity has lost itself and its own sensibilities. Now, in direct contrast to that, in lots of ways, we have Simon, who we've said throughout our study of this novel is the perceptive figure, and he's prepared to state and say what the other boys cannot or will not say, because he will think differently. He is a figure who is an outsider. He is a figure who is othered, and that means separated out, ostracised, left to one side. And it is Simon who sees this and has this vision as he stands in front of the Lord of the Flies. And, we have to remember that Simon and Piggy, in that sense, are parallel characters. They're both outsiders, they're both othered, they both don't fit, and ultimately they're both the figures who are killed in this novel. These are the figures who don't fit into society, don't have a voice, and are often denied a voice or ignored, and their wisdom is often ignored, and their insight is often ignored. And how often is that the case in society? That the outsider, the person who doesn't fit, is the person who is denied a voice, is denied an opportunity to speak. And Golding symbolically references that here with the swollen tongue that Simon is developing as a result, literally in this point of the novel, of his dehydration. But symbolically, more importantly, his perception is silenced. He is prevented from speaking. He's prevented from voicing his own views and opinions. He's prevented from revealing the truth, because Simon is our truth speaker in this novel. The voice of the threat, then, is dominating. The voice of the Lord of the Flies, the voice of darkness, the voice of this kind of disgusting version of humanity, is allowed to dominate and take over, because Simon, as someone who is othered, as an outsider, is silenced. So, we move into this next section of the passage as Simon is perceiving and seeing the Lord of the Flies speaking. He says, "Only me, and I am the beast." So we have Simon's vision. It is arguably a hallucination, but Golding is still including it clearly for symbolic effect as well. But here, Simon is finally seeing the true nature of the beast that they're all scared of, the beast that they're all terrified by. And that's being revealed to Simon. And it's significant that Simon is the one who can see it, because the figure of the Lord of the Flies goes on to taunt that fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill. Because, of course, that darkness, that blackness, that rotting core of humanity can't be hunted, it can't be killed, it can't be wiped out. Golding is stating and showing us that darkness, the beastliness of humanity, is a part of all of us, and it can't be killed, and it can't be hunted, and it can't be extinguished and taken away. And certainly, this is a cynical worldview. This is a negative worldview. And it is this depressing, worried, anxious perspective that we were often seeing in the novels of the mid-century as we moved from a recovery from the World War II into the terror and fear caused by the Cold War in the middle of the 20th century. It goes on. We have this echo with the parody of laughter. There's this cruel mockery of Simon's powerlessness. Simon being made powerless because his tongue is swollen, but also powerless because he's an outsider. He's there and he's on his own. All he can say, just about stumble out, brought forth those audible words, is pig's head on a stick. He's only able to literally describe what he sees in front of him. And we have here an image that is really a means through which Golding is drawing the association and the parallel between this rotting pig's head and the boys. He's making it more clear. Because we have here, his eyes were half closed, Simon's eyes were half closed, as though he were imitating the obscene thing on the stick. So Golding is now drawing an explicit parallel between the Lord of the Flies and the boys themselves. Therefore, he is signalling to us that the boys are, and humanity as a whole, are just as rotten as this pig's head. There is here Golding offering a clear comment that the darkness and the threat that Simon perceives is within each member of humanity, each person of humanity, and within each of the boys. And each of the boys are full of the same darkness that the Lord of the Flies represents, and are just as susceptible to evil in the same way that we see here. Now, as we continue to move on, we have some biblical allusion and biblical references starting to come through. We can perhaps see that the island is a purgatory, a middle space, before you go to heaven or to hell, this holding space. But here the Lord of the Flies promises that the boys will end up down there. This is undoubtedly a reference to hell, that the boys will end up being somehow punished. And this same allusion is found in the Bible as well, that the people being consumed by these vast mouths. It's as though Simon is seeing the mouth of the pig looming over him now. And Simon sees himself being consumed, and being consumed by, symbolically, by this darkness, and therefore being consumed and overwhelmed by evil and the nature of evil itself. And the fact that it's vast, it does seem to suggest its enormity, the enormity of this darkness, the enormity of this evil that cannot be escaped, that can't be put to one side. And it's certainly, as part of this allegory, we see that even Simon is being consumed by this blackness. Even Simon, who is this perceptive figure, who doesn't engage in the brutality of the savagery, even he is being consumed by this blackness and evil. And that we as humans, our descent to evil is inevitable and unavoidable. And we are all consumed by it, consumed by the consequences of it, or through engaging in those brutal, harsh and evil acts ourselves. Of course, we then have the repeated blackness as well, and that only intensifies as the novel goes on. We know blackness is associated with evil, with sin, and the fact that it is spreading as well. So again, there is the sense that this cannot be stopped, this cannot be halted, this cannot be put to one side. And we move then into the final sentence of this passage. Simon was inside the mouth, he fell down and lost consciousness. So until this point, Simon has been silent, Simon has been unable to speak, he has been unable to resist and unable to argue against this voice of evil. But now he's inside the mouth, he is being consumed, he is finally being utterly overwhelmed by this. And this is preempting, of course, his death, just in a few pages' time. But he is being overwhelmed firstly by the presence of evil, by this reminder, this symbol of evil. Okay, so we have our track and trace activity, and we're just going to start off with one of those questions about that fallout between Ralph and Jack. And we have, Ralph actually, for a moment, wresting control and actually having control, and Jack responding with this statement, "I'm not going to play any longer, not with you." So we have established the division between the boys. Harmony and fairness has been lost, and the boys start to fragment, and their structures fail and fall apart. So there is also this critical word here of play. Jack still sees life on the island as a game, and he fails to see the consequences of his actions and decisions. So how does that connect to this next one? Beyond the screen of leaves, the sunlight pelted down and the butterflies danced in the middle of their unending dance. Well, we looked at this quotation in the context of the sow being killed. So here we have the outcome of the dispute. We have the sow's death disrupting the peace and beauty of the island, in the same way that the boys' structures have fallen and failed completely, and in that sense is increasing as the novel progresses, as we're moving into the final third of the novel in this chapter. So we have in this moment the sunlight pelted down and the butterflies danced in the middle of their unending dance. Well, it's described as an unending dance, but the boys disrupt this. So the boys disrupt the natural order. Humans disrupt, therefore, in Golding's representation, the natural order. Beyond the screen of leaves, the sunlight pelted down. So there is a warmth and a brightness and a hopefulness in untarnished nature. And of course, the important point here is that the sow is killed in this setting. So it stains that setting. And alongside that, this very fragile symbol of the butterflies. These are fragile, they are short-lived, they are fleeting. And we see that actually life, humanity, and nature, all of these things are as equally as fragile and fleeting as one another. And then as we continue to move through the novel, and as we get to Castle Rock, we have Piggy's disastrous, traumatic death. And this particularly vivid and graphic description from Golding. His head opened up and stuff came out and turned red. Piggy's arms and legs twitched a bit like a pig's after it had been killed. Well, we go from we have stuff coming out of his head and turning red. And we have this moment in this death. He loses the identification of being human, just like the sow did earlier in the novel. And he's become ill-defined. Okay, it's just stuff that's coming out of him now. It's almost too horrific to consider. The boys
are unable to define the consequences of their violence. In the same way as killing the sow kills the maternal figure who can reproduce and produce enough food for the rest of the island. And then here we have Piggy's arms and legs twitched a bit like a pig's after it had been killed. And this simile is really critical here. We have, in the same way as the Lord of the Flies reflects humanity, and we have here the connection and parallel emphasised that humans are reduced to livestock, to slaughter. Ultimately, we are rendered worthless. So we can see and track and trace through these ideas from the fallout of the boys and the separation of the boys all the way through to the way in which they disrupt and disturb the natural world, and we see the final outcome of that is the way in which Golding places mankind and humans and the boys in parallel with the figure of the pig, taking away and stripping away all of our status, just reducing us to stuff, as it says in this quotation, reducing us simply to flesh, reducing and stripping away all of our humanity, so that in the end, by the end of the novel, all we have are consistent and constant negations. Humans, figures being removed and deleted from the novel, having their humanity stripped away from them, having their definition as humans taken away from them, all because of this inevitable, rapid and continual movement towards savagery. Okay, so we have these three core questions that we've been touching on and have been the heart and the centre of our thinking for this video. What is the increasing dispute between Jack and Ralph signal? Why is the killing of the sow significant? And Simon engages with the Sow's Head, the Lord of the Flies. What does this signal and why? So let's just start with this one, and we pick this up in the track and trace activity. But that dispute between Jack and Ralph signals that final fall and failure of the boys to communicate and work together. This is very much about the failure of democracy. This is about society fracturing and the danger of society fracturing rather than working together cohesively and as a whole. We see here Ralph being a representation of democracy and a reminder of democratic values and the importance of them as he maintains the system with the conch, even if that is at times a little bit problematic. Whereas Jack is an authoritarian figure. He is a figure who leads without using democracy, without any of those processes that would take on board and listen to the wider voices of society. So we see that dispute, that fracturing between them. It allows Jack's authoritarian nature to come out more fully and completely, and it also signals to us it's also a signal to us of the increasingly rapid failure of democracy and democratic values. And of course, Golding is showing us the risks of that. And that takes us into the killing of the sow, because the dispute between Jack and Ralph has been just as much about the fire and hunting. Ralph clearly values the fire, using that as a signal through which they can be rescued, whereas the killing of the sow is Jack's turn to lead in this authoritarian manner and take total control of the boys. And of course he does while he's leading the killing of the sow, and his success in that allows him to take further power as the novel goes on. But it's also a moment at which it's a moment through which we see the foolishness of mankind being exposed. By killing the sow, you kill the figure in the novel who could reproduce to continue making sow so that the boys could survive on the island for longer where it required. But also the killing of the sow is the moment where the boys' savagery, having been just about held in check, having been just about kept in control, is fully released. The boys are described as hunters, they're not described as boys anymore, their innocent identities are being left to one side, and the savagery is unleashed more fully. We have the sadistic killing of the pig that takes a long time, and there's this exhausting process. But there's also that lust for murder and death. There is a definite sadistic pleasure being taken with killing the sow, and we see the sow, and the moment the sow being killed is this moment that savagery is fully released. It's like a genie being let out of the bottle. Once you release this savagery, it cannot be then contained again until a more powerful figure comes, and ultimately that requires the arrival of the adults at the end of the novel. And finally, we examine in this video Simon engaging with the Sow's Head, the Lord of the Flies. And this is Simon confronting evil, confronting the nature of evil. And in this part of the allegory, Golding is showing us the true evil of humanity. And it is Simon who sees it. Simon, the voice who is othered and otherwise silenced and ignored and ostracised. We as the reader are being confronted with the darkness of humanity, with this rotting pig's head, as though flesh itself is rotting and decaying, and therefore humanity itself is symbolically falling apart. But it is only Simon who confronts it. Only one figure in the novel is shown that, whereas we as the reader are encouraged to see that more widely. It is only Simon who sees it, and his next interaction is not to reveal what the true beast is, the beast that exists within each of the boys and therefore humanity as a whole. Simon's killed. That is the next interaction that we have with Simon. So this perception, this moment of clarity where the beast is revealed to be a figment of their imagination, but also a construction of their own lack of humanity, their own darkness inside them, a reflection of the darkness that is inside the boys, the evil that is inside the boys and all of humanity at large. Instead he's silenced, he's killed as the boys rehearse a ritual again. And he is the first of those boys to be explicitly killed by another one of the members of the boys on the island. So in that sense, it's signalling to us this moment of revelation, but it's a moment of revelation that is immediately stripped away from us, and is immediately stripped away from the boys as well. And we said with the question above it, the killing of the sow is this release of violence and brutality. Well, Simon engaging with the Lord of the Flies is possibly the last rational moment where Simon is allowed to see the true nature of mankind, the darkness of mankind, the fact that the beast, this darkness, lingers within humanity as a whole.